Hey everybody, my name's Trevor. I'm the associate pastor here at First Church, and I'm bringing you another lament video here as we walk through Lent leading up to Easter this year. I was reading Lamentations 2. I talked in my first video of Lamentations 1. I read Lamentations 2. I don't like it. I really don't. This is not the type of stuff that I want to read about God. I don't want to read about what God does in his anger. I don't want to read about God declaring himself the enemy of his people. The first 8 verses of Lamentations 2 just talks about how God is reacting to his people in anger. It shows us how big God's emotions can be. And really, as we talked about briefly in first video, how seriously God takes the sin of his people. Any sacrifice that the Israelites tried to offer was spurned because God was so angry. He declared himself the adversary of Israel. His anger, it's consuming everything. It's destroying everything. And I just wanted to stop reading even after those first 8 verses. And we see very much here how true the words of Dallas Willard are when he says that God isn't mean, but he is dangerous. And it shows for a real and symbolic sense how the scattering of the people Israel was for them spiritually. While they had been lamenting, certainly, most of their time had been spent trying to survive. Even the animals in their situation still nursed their young, but the Israelites were so desperate to survive that they ate their own children. Think of how desperate that lament piece is. It shows the decline of the people towards a cruelty very much like an ostrich in the wilderness. An ostrich is known for abandoning their young. And more than that, anyone who was important, anyone who was affluent or high status, they lost everything. They were impoverished. They had traded their bright garments for trash heaps, which is something we can even think of Job in the book of Job in the Old Testament as well. He sat in a trash heap too. Everything had been destroyed, and anyone that had any connection to God had lost it. The prophets didn't have visions anymore. The city leaders just sat in silence. They had spent so much time in mourning that their lament had just turned to silent acceptance. And I'm guessing that at some point in your life, you've experienced what the author speaks of in verse 11, where your eyes are all worn out from weeping. If you haven't experienced what it's like to cry so much that you no longer have any tears to shed, you physically cannot shed any more tears, but still be in a sorrowful place, it is a rough place to be. And all that the prophets had left was just this inner churning. The author here, I initially thought that it had to do with an inner turmoil, but the translation is more like this giant pit in the stomach that many of us get when something is definitely not as it should be. It's this gut-wrenching pain that we feel as a result of the physical suffering that we are experiencing. And ultimately, the suffering that they're experiencing, it hasn't been dealt to anybody else. They're the only recipient. And so in addition to that injury, there's further insult that's added to the Israelites because everyone who is their enemy, everyone who passed them by, just scorned them and trashed them, made fun of them, you name it. They took the opportunity to rub this pain in their face. And so this really, coming into the end of chapter 2 of Lamentations, it's this simultaneous call from the prophet to the people of Jerusalem to lament. He says, cry out to God, ask for mercy. Even more, it's a reminder for the people of God that he has done exactly what he said he was going to do. God's people knew his law. They knew what it said. They knew what it required. They knew their nation's history, their tendencies, and they knew the punishment that would behold itself if they did not honor their commitment to God. Yet they still found themselves cut off from him and punished in suffering. And I think this helps us understand that God is always going to be true to who he is. He's always going to uphold his standard. The choices that we make, the things that we do in alternative to worship and relationship with God, they don't change God. And we can thank God for this a little bit, and that he did what he said he would do in dwelling among us, becoming incarnate, sending Jesus. While we'll look more in depth about this in future videos that I put out, just really about the hope of restoration within the book of Lamentations, I believe it just behooves us for a second to just think about this. God said that he would send his son, and he did. He said he would take our sin, and he did. He said anyone who would pick up their cross and follow him would gain life, and we have. Everything that God says he's going to do, he does. And maybe you're like me and you didn't like this chapter. You went back and you read through it. You paused the video. I don't want to read these parts of the Bible, but more than ever, I need to. I can't turn a blind eye to my sin. I can't turn a blind eye to God's anger towards sin. But we have to recognize God's sovereignty and holiness in contrast to ourselves, because it's then that we're able to lament our sin properly. It's looking at ourselves and God, and seeing what Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about when he says this about living a devout life with God. He says the contrast between our behavior and the words of Jesus is all too painfully evident. And so my question for you as we wrap up our second video here is, what in your life do you need to lament?